Final speaker for this panel is Moko Morris from Te Aitanga A Mahaki and Te Atiawa, who is the Sustainable Communities Coordinator with the Kāpiti Coast District Council and co-chair of the Aotearoa New Zealand SDG Stakeholder Group. Nā reira, e te tuahine, ka tukuna atu te rākau kōrero ki a koe.
Tēnā koutou, nā nihu rei o te kaupapa, ko te SDG, tēnā koutou. He mihi atu ki a koe, Corbin, mō te manaakitanga, i te pōnei, ki te whakapiri a mātou, koutou hoki ko Erika, ko Thomas. He uru tāku no te tairawhiti, no te Aitanga A Mahaki, no te Atiawa hoki, ko Moko Morris ahau. So when I first heard about the SDGs, I really grappled with how they could possibly impact or affect a small Māori village in Aotearoa in the South Pacific. And so I had to kind of locate myself in this. So firstly, I thought about my my immediate whānau that I care for and are committed to. And you know, we look after each other and manage our whānau together. And then I thought about our extended whānau, how we are together, our hapu, wahia, and our wider connections. So I don't see that often, but closely connected through our heart and our tupuna. Then I have our iwi, who are wider still and more spread out, but we're still connected as well. So trying to work out where we sit in with this SDGs and sharing values and commitment to whenua and iwi development. And then I thought about our Pacific cousins who share our voyaging history, our language, and our whakapapa. And finally, then I thought about our whānau overseas, no Tawahi, our Indigenous brothers and sisters who share our struggles and our wairua nourishing traditions. And that's perhaps where I thought the SDGs might come into that conversation. But then that's also about manaakitanga and kotahitanga, which we do on a daily basis. So I guess it's about subscribing to a global framework, and what we do here affects an Indigenous person on the other side of the world. So that's where I thought it would fit in. So I thought about food. I thought about when you buy, say, for example, bananas, if you're buying fair trade bananas, coffee, tea, sugar, you know, these tiny acts are the difference between sending Indigenous teenagers to university or not. And I met a young woman from Ecuador whose higher education hinged on people in developed countries like ours buying fair trade bananas. But then we think about the overall situation of Indigenous peoples worldwide, including Aotearoa. It can kind of be described as, we're not really left behind, but rather pushed further behind. And this is mainly due to land grabbing, widespread human rights violations, and worsening inequality. And land grabbing still happens through public works acts here, so it's very much a threat today in our country. As Indigenous peoples globally, excluded and almost invisible in most SDG national action plans and strategies. And then we've got alarmingly 80% of biodiversity is protected by Indigenous people internationally, but only 10% of these territories have legal security. And so it doesn't paint a good picture around human rights. There's also, I think in 2019, at least 125 cases of political killings of Indigenous leaders occurred, mostly from defending land or organising people to defend land. So there's incredible lack of accountability, like Sasha said, and implementation of human rights violations and obligations, including failure to act on recommendations made by human rights advocates and organisations. So kia ora, Sasha, for bringing this up. So the SDGs are really simply a framework, that's all. And we must uphold the mana of Te Tiriti of Waitangi first. We constantly remind government as treaty partners that under Article 1, they have a duty and responsibility to protect Māori in pursuit of our rights to taonga, which in some of the work I do, it's around kaiatua. We shouldn't have to remind the government, but that's our reality. A more recent example is the Organic Products Bill, which has been through Select Committee at the moment, and despite Māori through Te Waka Kaiora asking for the Treaty of Waitangi to be recognised in this, it wasn't. So there was, a bill before Parliament that had not one mention of the Treaty of Waitangi in this day and age. So it's not just historical injustices that are happening on a day-to-day basis, history. It's also, day-to-day breaches that are often quite blatant. I think the worst part of some of this work that we do in this space is that you often feel like you're complaining all the time, or you're checking words or documents and scanning the areas that could be improved, because as we know, language is so important. And then you kind of get triggered because you can't believe you're back in this boring space of having to maintain your ground and kind of explain yourself time and time again and offer advice that's mostly ignored, and it's tiring. One of the organisations I work with, Māori organisation, Te Puna Oranga, one of the thoughts we had was to employ a PA, a Pākehā advisor, to create a position around someone that could just deal with some of these things that we didn't have to deal with time and time again. So I think the process of decolonisation is essential to all of this. So Te Tiriti workshops, decolonisation workshops are particularly important to those agencies, especially those ones that hold all the perceived power. So a good way to look at it is, in the workplace, you often have to do first aid certificates, and these expire after maybe 2 years. So if you had to do treaty workshops or cultural competencies workshops through your local hapu, then you would move yourself along the journey. You wouldn't be stuck in a place where I've done an online course or I've done something, but you're revisiting that as your knowledge builds and your experience builds around it. You can keep that conversation going. It sounds kind of easy, but it's often not, because as you know, definitions of almost everything vary from culture to culture. So, I think the easiest and most logical way to honour the treaty is to give funding and decision making back to Māori on the ground through Māori organisations and iwi and hapu. Thinking about the SDGs, and I guess I've gone off track too and haven't really dealt with the question. It's if you look at indicators. You could say something in front of them. So you could say, as a treaty partner, my expression of SDG involves te mea, te mea, te mea. I honour the treaty. I understand the treaty is the founding document of Aotearoa. Through SDG 12, we do this. In partnership with our local hapu, we value the role Te Tiriti has in Aotearoa, and this is how we express it. So you don't have to be confined by the SDGs and their indicators. You can add something on that truly and genuinely represents where you're at and your commitment. Finally, I think I would like to end with a favourite saying from Eva Rickard, which was lead, follow, or get out of the way. And I feel that's where a lot of us on the ground are at right now. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe moko, o tira e mihi ana kia koe me au kōrero. I was wondering for a moment what the PA was, and then when you followed up with Pākehā advisor, I was, that's not quite what I was thinking, but yeah, it's fantastic. I could do with several of those to help me with some of my mahi. And I get the sense as well that there was a strong linkage there to that kōrero from Sasha as well around, we've been doing some of these same things for close to 40 years, and we're still seeing very little meaningful change in some ways. We've got time for a couple
worldviews. So I think it's really tempting to do the equivalent of the natives to the rescue. But there's a couple of really important caveats to that. First is we've got to save ourselves before we save the rest of the world. We've got really pressing and complex challenges in our own communities. and we're by nature generous, but there are limits to that generosity, and I'm not sure that we'd want that responsibility. I think that when it comes to change, we do have to acknowledge that the values, the assumptions, the framing of problems and solutions that have got us to this point will not serve us to build solutions, which does mean that we need different values and different people to contribute to decision making. And that's where I think people have to give up something. People who are in comfortable positions of power have to give up some degree of power. People who are doing good work with good intent will still have the same experience of needing to make themselves uncomfortable to contemplate things they haven't contemplated before. And equally, when Māori go into non-Māori environments, we have to experience different forms of being uncomfortable as well. I think we've all got to learn how to be uncomfortable together and not step on each other's toes too much.
Tēnā koe, Sasha. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for any more questions, but I just really wanted to touch on the fact that we had a number of questions kind of framed around how does an individual or how do I as a Pākehā support or work in partnership with Māori communities at a hapu and iwi level. And I think Sasha actually, in a roundabout way, answered that in terms of, we've got to be prepared to give up a bit of power, but also have those uncomfortable and sometimes confrontational conversations and courageous conversations at that too, with the hope that, if we can level the playing field to a certain extent, i.e. be equally uncomfortable in an environment, we've got the possibility to be very creative in terms of how we achieve that change.